Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachijian, and today I'm joined by Brett Bartholomew. Brett Bartholomew is a strength and conditioning coach, author, consultant, and founder of the performance coaching and consulting company, Bartholomew Strength. His expertise includes working with collegiate teams, professional teams, businesses, and individual clients. Taken together, Brett has coached a diverse range of athletes from across 23 sports at levels ranging from youth to Olympians. He supported Super Bowl and World Series champions, along with professional fighters, including those competing in the UFC. He has also worked with members of the United States Special Forces community. His coaching and speaking has spanned the globe, from China to Brazil, and numerous other stops in between. His book, Conscious Coaching, The Art and Science of Building Buy-In, achieved bestseller status in the categories of sport coaching, business money, and was ranked in the Amazon Top 100 books overall. I first met Brett in 2015 at Mike Robertson's Physical Preparation Summit in Indianapolis. And what impressed me was Brett's transparency and willingness to share information. His presentation in 2015 was actually the impetus for a presentation that I did at the very same summit the following year, where I discussed a case study that I did with an injured athlete. And the whole idea was I wanted to share with the audience there exactly what I do with people in a way that they could be critical of and that would be a platform for discussion. A lot of times people, particularly in the social media age, will only share just enough about what they do to make themselves intriguing and marketable, and they'll kind of speak in abstracts, but they'll neglect the details, because a lot of times it's the details that make us vulnerable. And Brett is just the opposite of that. I mean, he tells you exactly what he does. And if you read his book, Conscious Coaching, he actually gets into some really personal details where he's definitely not afraid to express his vulnerability. And I think you'll see that kind of transparency permeate our discussion on the podcast here. So again, Brett's one of those people who is an expert in multiple domains, not just performance training. And his global perspective, I think, has actually made him a better practitioner. Brett, thanks so much for your time. I know you've been busy relocating to Atlanta and promoting a book and doing all kinds of speaking engagements. So I wanted to start out. Your journey as a coach has been quite impressive and interesting. And right now you're kind of known as somebody, you wrote the book Conscious Coaching, which is really more about the behavioral and psychological aspects of coaching and performance, but you're also a true technical expert in the field. So at what point did you decide, okay, like I've developed enough of my technical expertise, now I want to delve into other areas of coaching. So how did that kind of journey begin, and then how did you get to where you are now?
Yeah, first off, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. I know you and I always have I feel like we've always had some interesting micro discussions offline, so it's nice to finally get together and set out a block of time. Quick correction in that, and I know you know this, I don't feel like I necessarily have had enough in terms of, or I know enough in terms of the technical side of it. I think you and I both know there's always more to learn. I think it's more of understanding and realizing that it by itself, the technical aspect by itself isn't enough of a robust skill set in order to really achieve the outcomes that we want. And I do feel confident that I can say that from the standpoint that at a relatively young age within my career, I was put in a position to work with a wide variety of high-level clientele, whether that was special forces operators, whether that was professional athletes. I mean, I certainly worked with youth and high school kids as well, but I was put in a situation where really young, really early, I had to get high-level people to buy into what I needed to do. And the only reason I feel like I was able to write this book from that standpoint is because I made the mistakes. I think oftentimes our society shows that, if you wrote a book, you must be an expert. You must have had success. You must have done these things. I tried to approach it from a different avenue. I tried to say, no, I actually wrote this book because of the failures I had and the things I did wrong. More specifically, at that time in my life, when I first started, I would read everything I could about periodization, sets and reps, just different movement type classifications, speed, agility. I'd go down the rabbit hole that I think you and so many other practitioners commonly go down and still maybe even perhaps go down. But what I realized is when I got out on the floor, even though I'd see the objective measures change in regards to progressive overload, people jumping higher, running faster, which of course doesn't always happen. Sometimes, your interventions don't work. But the reality was that to get that long-term inveterate kind of behavior change, it required me getting to know the person, not just the performer. And that could be an early turnoff to some people because then they think, oh, here we go. Now we're going to go down this kind of soft, warm landslide of, being in tune with emotions, knowing people's names, holding their hands. That's not what it's about. The art of coaching is nothing more than the science of connecting. And I think that's been something that's been ignored for a while. I think people just think the art of coaching is warm, feel good, sing-songy, almost kind of, radio pop chart nonsense where people can ABC this information into a relatively engaging presentation, talk about how it's not all about the numbers and move on. The reality is when you deep dive into the science of connecting, human nature, engagement, communication, you find that it's actually far more objective in regards to its data support than anything that we do from a training standpoint. I mean, you look at how Google Analytics, you look at how social media analytics, you look at how companies that create advertising campaigns, people that create, different safe driving campaigns, right? Like the click it or stick it, the seatbelt kind of stuff. All these things are created not by accident. They actually draw upon certain tendencies, rhyme schemes, presentation formats that make people react and respond in very calculated, almost hamster on a wheel type ways. So I wanted to kind of extrapolate on that, talk about how some of those things can play a role in the day-to-day coaching practice of what we do, and shine light on the fact that it's not about the science and the art, but there's actually a science to the art of coaching. Yeah,
and I by no means meant to imply that you were sort of content with your technical knowledge, but you answered the question. I mean, that was a great answer. And can you elaborate a little bit more, because you spoke to this a little bit. Even people who mean well and kind of will promote your work will say, oh, here's Brett talking about soft skills. And I kind of see that as a derogatory term, because as you alluded to, I mean, there's a really hard science behind the things that you talk about in conscious coaching. And a lot of it's based on your experience, but you also reference quite a few scientific publications and journals. So can you talk about the actual research that you did to write your book and some of the hard science behind your methodology?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm with you. I get a little bit offended too, unreasonably so. I don't know why, it's almost like you're protective of it. I get a little offended as well when people are like, oh, it's a soft skill. And I know what they mean by that. There's a little bit of the, that isn't supposed to be a derogatory term, but when you think of a soft skill, you think of something that really can't be, again, objectively measured or developed. Well, why are there entire university departments based upon these things, right? The science of communication, psychosocial skills and development, sociological outcomes, and all those pieces. There's entire university departments based on that, right? You look at consulting firms, you look at any major brand in America, and they pour hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars focused on content creation, engagement, and client and consumer behavior, right? Behavior is a far, far, far bigger industry than performance is, but the two are inextricably linked. So I think the issue in our field has become that the majority of people get, the typical Journal of Applied Physiology, NSCA Strength and Conditioning Journal, things related to physical therapy, biomechanics, what have you, but oftentimes don't go outside of those means and look at different, other journals or other resources or publications. I mean, even other books or texts, you still get so many people that when a young performance professional goes up and says, I'd like to learn more about X, Y, and Z, oftentimes that reading list that's provided to them, is almost all performance-oriented kind of tomes, right? And at best, if you're lucky, you might get a Dale Carnegie or John Maxwell book, but you certainly don't get a lot of books written by other performance professionals that talk about people and performance and perception and process and how all these things fuse together to really take all that technical tactical knowledge and make it come to life. So I just think that we, despite being in an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary model, we've really gotten myopic and instead stayed within our comfort zone and instead just become obsessed with progressions, regressions, lateralizations, however you want to term it, which again have their point. This isn't an argument at which one is better or best. It's about the realization that we've ignored the science behind the art for too long and haven't developed really socially skilled practitioners at the same level that we've developed technically or tactically competent practitioners. And that becomes an issue when you're dealing with people that are filled with emotions and perceptions and judgments and reason.
Yeah, and one thing that people don't really talk about, it's kind of like the elephant in the room in our profession, is that a lot of the research that people reference, or a lot of the doctrine in strength and conditioning and performance, is based on Eastern European or Soviet methods, where, I mean, very few of us, I know I haven't read the actual studies that have influenced the writing of some of these books. And what people also don't really mention is that, yes, like they did a lot of research and collected a lot of data, but people also from a very young age were handpicked for particular sports, and they grew up in sports academies. So even despite this research, you can't separate that from the social environment and the political environment. So to take research from that type of population and then try to transfer it into like the United States, for example, may not necessarily have that much carryover. So you talk a little bit about the minutia, and I feel like sometimes in our field, people will argue, like, is it better in the weight room to do 3 sets of 5 or 5 sets of 3? Or I remember, one thing I love about your Instagram is that it's actually relative to other strength and conditioning Instagram accounts, like very unentertaining. And I mean that in a complimentary way, because it's just people doing the basics well. So it's guys, sprinting for short distances when they're not fatigued and changing direction and doing basic lifts with good form under load. It's not somebody, wearing an altitude mask, doing a battling ropes on a Bosu ball while being shot at with a super soaker, stuff like that. But I remember in one of your posts, you wrote, you showed some guys doing some maximal speed work, and you were like, it was pretty sarcastic, but it was like, hey guys, like, sorry, we only had time for these guys to rest 4 minutes in between bouts of maximal sprints. I couldn't have them rest the full 20 minutes like the book says. But how much does that stuff really matter? Like, even if you had that kind of time, do you think it even matters if you rested these guys 16 more minutes in between sets and had them do 3 reps instead of 5, especially with the kind of team sport athletes you're working with where there's so many variables?
I think it matters if you're doing it in a lab, right? But like you said, once you start dealing with so many other variables, how are you really going to tease those things out in the world of team sports, right? It's that whole kind of clearer, fuzzier spectrum and continuum that Dan John talked about at one of his conferences. He just says the role of the S&C coach, or you could even just say performance professional, right? Because it's physios involved with that as well. You sit here and like to think that everything you do makes some like, oh, like this is the difference. This is what's going to get us ahead. And the reality is you can't say that. Even if you have these guys, their metrics and your monitor up, to the nth degree, you're still dealing with so many little differences, nuances, contingencies, whether it's the weather, whether it's the friction or the type of surface, whether that's their diet over the past 2 weeks, 30 days, whatever it was. It's so hard to replicate and recreate it, which is why I think I've always been a big stickler for simplicity, because when you can't control many of the variables, like, you can at least fall back on consistency and say, listen, I know I can't control every variable and I can't highlight that this one thing or that one thing is what changed it, but I have ran with a consistent thought process, methodology, or principle base for a while, and I haven't seen it fail me in a grandiose fashion yet. Right. And so you can point to something within that recipe. And it is like that. It's like a family recipe passed down. Right? Like every generation is going to infuse it with maybe their own little kind of change, or maybe the brand of the spices will change. But by and large, the order of that recipe is set in place. And I think that's what we need to focus on, is quit worrying about these 1 or 2 things that you think are going to make the biggest difference. A lot of it is the time-tested consistency and behavior. And you can't argue with that. Study chefs. Right? Study anything outside of our realm, and you'll find that it just doesn't work that way. And I think that's another kind of mind map or mental frame that we need to fight. We think that our job is so unique, so special, when in reality, a funny aside is my father's a financial advisor, and I used to remember watching him get ready for work, and it was the suit and tie nonsense, 8 million sprays of cologne, watching the stock market, CNBC, MSNBC, all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, okay, I'm at the University of Nebraska. I'm watching spring practice. Your job sucks. I get to wear athletic clothes and work out and do this and that. And then it dawned on me one day that, there was no bigger correlation than investing, or even what my brother does with cooking and owning restaurants, than there was coaching. Because with investing, right, it's paying attention to trends, occurrences, being able to guide and sometimes counsel individuals or investors to make sure their emotions don't get in the way of kind of their actions and behaviors. It's being able to ride out the wave. My father always had this picture in his office that showed the New York Stock Exchange over the past century, and it showed the peaks, the valleys, the highs and lows. But by and large, it always showed that if you just stayed in there and rode out the wave, that you're still better off investing than not dabbling in it at all, right? It's the people that try to get too cute, too fancy, or listen to the big tip that end up going under. And history and business and the culinary arts, all these abstract things or seemingly abstract things to us teach us everything we need to know about coaching. We just ignore it. We ignore it and we become destined to relearn the same lessons that countless other coaches have learned before us. And then that's why we sit down when we watch a presentation of somebody talking about simple things done savagely well, and we love it, and it seems so endearing, and it seems to restore our faith in what we're doing, because it reminds us that, like, oh yeah, we keep getting on this roller coaster again and again and again. And maybe, Doug, maybe some of it is just people are gluttons for that kind of disappointment or emotional high and low. But you're not, by and large, none of us are going to learn that some form of progressive, or I know Buddy Morris doesn't like the term progressive overload, let's say fluctuating overload, periodic overload, whatever terminology we want to use. We're not going to come up to some new system that shows that some combination of work plus rest equals success is no longer the case, right? But until the end of time, we'll keep searching. And I think we've got to be careful. This might be a little bit of a soapbox rant, but another thing I tend to get tired of is this martyrism that we have. Like, sometimes we'll get myopic and we'll say I'm a lifelong learner, that myopic or martyr kind of personality or persona also kind of goes into how we view our jobs. We sacrifice everything in the name of our athletes. Like, make up your mind, right? Like, are we a humble profession, or are we ones that pin ourselves to the stake and just say we're the best at learning, we're the best at sharing, we're the best at this, when in reality, like I said, we just keep learning the same lessons again and again. And it's a little silly, and it's a little kind of, I would almost say, narcissistic to think that somebody out there has one answer, and we're going to find that, and our program is going to be fantastic.
Yeah, and I think that segues nicely into the next thing I wanted to talk about, because I have these existential moments where, I think that what I do is important. Otherwise, I wouldn't want to waste people's time and money. But I'm also sometimes, what am I really doing with people? Am I really doing what I say or what I think? In other words, if I'm working with a really high-level baseball player or football player, basketball player, I don't think I'm necessarily making that person better at the sport. I'm probably helping keep that person available to play that sport and express the athleticism that he or she already has. So probably, I think if anything, I help with availability. But, and you always see when people in our field are promoting themselves are what I'm doing is going to transfer over to the field more than what so-and-so is doing. And I feel like none of us can actually say that. There's way too many variables. We have no way of knowing if what we're doing really transfers. So I guess my question to you is, what do you think it is that people like you and I are actually doing when we work with athletes? Because you work with some really high-level people. I mean, guys in the NFL who genetically, just based on how they were born, probably are at the limits of what human physiology is capable of anyway. I mean, some of these guys can run a 4.3 with very minimal training outside of just helping them with their technique work at the start. How much faster are you actually going to make those guys versus, you're working on things that you presumably think are important, but what is it that you think you're actually doing, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think there's still a form of preparation. I'm with you. Like, speed is a different thing, right? I would never go to an NFL team or work with an NFL player and think that, oh my God, I'm going to make this guy so much faster, right? You may make adjustments and you may make tweaks. But my background's in motor learning. That's what my master's degree is in. I've done a lot of research on kind of sensitive periods and this kind of notion of, how much can we really affect speed, unless it's the universal thing we're training, right? If I'm talking to Dan Paff or Stu McMillan or anybody, in their league that's literally working with athletes that work on that one quality, with athletes who have continued to work on that one quality for a very long period of time, and there's not much interference, right? There's not many other things that they need to develop, that's one thing. I think you can extend sensitive periods, or I think you can extend kind of the plasticity of those neural models and get them to continue to refine. But when you're dealing with multi-sport athletes, or even say multi-directional team sport athletes, to think that you're going to have this kind of universal focus on one trait, or even be able to address, let's say I'm working on speed. Well, by and large, if you're programming correctly, you're only going to work on speed or some aspect of the speed continuum, whether that's acceleration or what have you, 2 days a week. And there's going to be some smart ass out there that probably says, well, we work on it every day because in the warm-up we hit it. And I get that, right? Like, you are going to use some kind of locomotive, motor behavior driven kind of activation, whatever term you want to use, drill in that warm-up. But by and large, to be able to objectively say that you're going to get somebody that was destined to run a 4.3 anyway, or is at the 1% of the 1%, and you're going to be able to get them X amount of tenths faster, you're probably setting yourself up for some level of disappointment, unless they're coming back from an injury, or unless they're so raw still in regards to their physical training development. But by and large, if they've had some exposure to training and they've been in a reasonably well-developed program, you're better off focusing your efforts elsewhere. And I just think that that's this kind of return to a balanced perspective. So there's two things we're doing. We are preparing, the neuromuscular system. We are preparing, the muscles, tendons, tissues, ligaments, bone structure. We are getting them calloused, to some type of environment or activity. I do think that there is that happening, right? That's just a matter of knowing the physiology and acknowledging that. But by and large, I think what we're doing is managing it, perhaps more so than developing it. I don't know if that makes sense, but to me, what I view that as is managing it, saying there's some level of base adaptation already there with these athletes, right? And so what we've got to make sure that we do is that, we kind of surf the curve, and I don't mean the force velocity continuum, but we surf the curve in terms of everything that they're going to be exposed to, whether that's plyometrics, high amplitude, low amplitude, whether that's, volume of running and the intensity of running, or weight room. We've got to balance that, but more so it also comes from the mental framework as well, as is helping these people understand the journey that they're a part of and how to prepare. So I do think it's a fallacy that we can sit here and say, I hate it when people try to take credit for athlete success, saying I did this, I did that. Most people should be saying proud to support, proud to guide or direct, proud to be a part of this journey. But if you're the one saying that we have the fastest athletes, we have the best athletes, I think that's a little silly, because it gets really hard to compare your training to all the other training interventions that athletes done. You might have just got them at the right time in their career. They might have the right environment around them, and that's a function of support and guidance more so than just, your capability.
Yeah, and I think that's a very comprehensive answer. And you alluded to measurement a little bit. And, it's very easy to be fatalistic when you're working in these complex systems and you say, well, we can't directly measure transfer, and then to make this, I think, erroneous deductive leap and say, well, we don't need to measure anything. But the flip side of that is I think there's probably, at least right now, kind of an overemphasis on measurement and quantifying things in our field. So what do you think is actually important to assess, from a testing standpoint, or physiologically monitor? And even if you said, I have a process and I watch guys when they run and when they warm up, and that's my screen, whatever, like that's actually pretty satisfying to me. But what is it that you think is actually important to look at and perhaps at times even test and monitor?
Yeah, I think you do have to, and this depends if you're, again, a physiotherapist, a performance coach, or what have you. But since you're asking me, I'm going to talk kind of a general overview from strength and conditioning standpoint. One, I think it's funny, like the debate about screens and this and that. I think one, just having a full, very comprehensive, well thought out medical history, piece that you have laid out for your clientele or your athletes, and then not just having them fill that out, but actually taking a moment to have a conversation. Now, I worked at a place that had no screening whatsoever and went there from a place that probably did a little bit too much screening. And I remember when I went out to the place that did nothing whatsoever, it was on me to kind of develop it. And you got the usual questions like, hey, what are you going to use? Are you going to use, are you going to use DARI? Are you going to use FMS? Are you going to use all these other ones? And it was like, well, first of all, like, no, anybody that knows behavior change knows that you're not just going to come into something where they did nothing and then all of a sudden, boom, hey guys, we have this super technical advanced model. So I think a medical questionnaire, actually having a conversation, some form of biomechanical screening, right? Whether that's an FMS, whether that's an SFMA, whether that's, upper quarter, lower quarter variance, whether that's, whatever you guys want to use. I was at collegiate environments that that use their own kind of variation of these things. I do think that you have to do some kind of movement analysis and just store that. I don't think that you necessarily program off of that. I used to do that. I'd look at the FMS and say, okay, this is what I need to do, not realizing that a lot of these asymmetries or quote unquote functional asymmetries were really context dependent, right? Such as the overhead squat. We've seen people that fail that miserably, but you put some load in their hands and all of a sudden the system can self-organize and they can perform that with a bit more higher quality. We've also seen how people can cheat screens, right? They can practice for the tests. And I think Greg Cook's spot on when he says, listen, stability is nothing more than motor learning or vice versa. So there's a lot of false positives that can be gained by that. So I think that the next piece is your warm-up, right? And that's nice because that is part of the screening procedure. If somebody's going to come in, I may FMS them or screen them cold, but then they're still going to go through some kind of warm-up before we do higher level physiology or physiological based testing, such as an agility test, a sprint test, eccentric utilization ratio, or some kind of reactive strength index. We've got to warm them up. So I'm going to pay attention to what they do in the sagittal, frontal, transverse planes, whether that's lunge matrix, lunge series, whether that's variants of skipping, marching, what have you. And then I tend to build my testing into my training, just because, as you know, there's not much time to waste in the private sector. I think there's that kind of misnomer that we have all the time in the world, and we live in this kind of neverland environment where we have 3 hours to train our athletes. But the reality is sometimes you may only have 45, 60, 90 minutes. So I like to get guys in right away. We'll start with some baseline kind of workout, and the goal is not necessarily even to stress the system in any kind of high level or advanced way, meaning that we may do some kind of goblet squat or front squat variant to kind of just look at squatting patterns. We're going to do some kind of split squat, some push pull. I'll put them into some variant of a total body routine in order to see how they handle the push pull squat hinge kind of matrix and see how that compares to, their screening procedure. Over time, over the course of that week or week and a half, depending on their fitness level, coming in, I'll obviously put in like a 10, 20-yard dash. If they are preparing for a combine, we'll do a 40. I try to do that within the first 2 weeks as opposed to the first day, just because of the inherent risk of hamstring strains. And then, look at multi-directional things as well. I favor a 505 kind of test or some kind of reactive agility test as well. But the main thing is you try to look at all these qualities: speed, strength, agility, eccentric utilization ratio, movement quality, all those pieces. And then I do a personality profile as well that I shoot them through a Google Doc. It's nothing super advanced. I would say probably its effectiveness lies in its simplicity, but just to get an idea of what coaches they've responded well to in the past, what kind of instruction they like, why they're there in the first place, all these things that can help me better kind of lay out a personality roadmap, not just a performance roadmap. So I know that's a long-winded answer, but I look at performance variables, personality variables, and then I try to fuse what I see together over the first 2 weeks and throughout the process to keep that program adapting and evolving.
Yeah, and you mentioned the personality testing, and I think one of the most interesting parts of your book is where you talk about these different personality constructs and tests that you use. But the tricky part, and I wanted to ask you this, is, all right, so you typically train people in groups, and not everybody's going to have the same personality type for the most part. I mean, I was lucky because when I read your book, you talk about the soldier personality, and I was in the military, and I work with a lot of military people in my human performance practice, and I'm like, they're actually in a lot of ways the easiest people to coach because they're so obedient and disciplined and compliant, and the biggest problem with them is they care so much they might almost work too hard. But now that I work at, I have a civilian medical practice in New York City, it's a lot different, and I've had to be much more adaptable in a way that I didn't have to be adaptable before. But when you're coaching, I mean, you're coaching multiple personalities at the same time every time you interact in a session. So how do you take those different personality types, and then how do you cater to each individual while coaching in a group?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to, and that's a good question. It's a common question I get, is a lot of it comes down to kind of the micro communication that you have within that group, right? It doesn't necessarily, you can do things certainly as advanced as saying, hey, based on the competitions or the type of skills we're going to work on during the week, we are going to organize certain drills according to this kind of 4x4 matrix of learn, acquire, bond, and defend, which speaks to, it's something I talk about on on one of my presentations. It's called The Impact of Influence. I put a webinar of it up on my website at bartholomewstrength.com. But I talk about these 4 evolutionary drives of human behavior: learn, acquire, bond, and defend. And we're able to tease out strategically some of the athletes that fit within these categories. And none of them are typecasted, right? None of them are like we're putting them in a box. We're just noticing there's certain tendencies that certain guys are more of the competitive nature. That's the acquire and defend. Some of them really just like being around more of that kind of environment where they're around others like them, and they can get a good workout in with other athletes that are similarly motivated. That's typically our bond type guys. There's learners, people that want to know kind of the minutia about every single drill or lift that we're doing, and those are kind of the drive to learn guys. And so we'll adapt different kind of station-based teaching drills based off those personality types, just as you kind of would look at and say, hey, we're going to start the session off with our movement prep or warm-up, then we're going to do some neuromuscular stuff, whether that's med ball or plyometrics, then we're going to get into skill acquisition, which can be your harness, marching, bounding, those kinds of things that work on postures and patterns. And then we're going to get into kind of the competitive piece, right, which is your sleds or your varied acceleration drills or cone drill starts. So we'll apply that learn, bond, defend model, acquire, defend model into those kinds of drills. We may even use velocity-based kind of training at a low level. I don't have the budget for gym aware or any of those kinds of things. So we started messing with push. And you look at guys that are kind of that acquire and defend matrix, they respond really well when they're matched up at a rack with somebody that now they have to compete for best bar velocity. And of course, you've got to manage that with technique, right? That should be hopefully inherent to anybody that's listening or understood. But a lot of times it just comes down to how you're managing the floor. And I think the most simple intervention is usually the most potent one. And from the standpoint that you're going to deal with a wide variety of athletes or personalities or clientele, regardless of what you do. And then most of you already know that, going down, it's more than just saying, hey, deeper, nice set, push through the floor, push the ground away, throw the bar to the ceiling. It is things like we already asked them about their sleep. We asked them about their diet, their nutrition. Well, asking them simple things about like, hey, what's going on outside of sport? Like, how's this going? Like, what kind of things are you into outside of football, basketball, baseball, what have you? At first, it's kind of like, Doug, and I know you've read the book, it's that 3R framework that I lay out. It's research, relate, and reframe. You ask micro questions, you have micro communications throughout the training session, and you gather some information. Then you try to relate it. So you try to show and share some vulnerability of your own to show them how you can understand or appreciate what they're talking about or what they engage with or find fascinating. And then you reframe it and you talk about how you show them that kind of common path. Hey, this is what I know you value or you find interesting or how you learn. This is what I'm trying to teach within it. And this is how we're doing it, right? You shape the path like the Heath brothers talk about. So there's nothing grandiose, and that's why it always cracks me up when people say I don't have the time. You already have conversations with your athletes daily. All you have to do is add in some other characteristics. Like, Doug, I may ask you, who is your favorite coach, or we could even just say teacher, and why, right? It could be Mr. Anderson because of the way that he took the time to explain things, or it could be Mrs. Smith because she would always find really creative ways to use metaphors and analogies, and that's how you learned. Those kinds of pieces are critical for us to excavate with our athletes so that we can connect with them at a higher level.
Yeah, and then, you continually preach kind of self-awareness. That's a huge theme in your book, self-awareness as a coach, and even athletes need to be self-aware to help communicate what they want better. So from your perspective, what do you think or right now, presently, is the limiting factor in your ability to achieve an outcome with an athlete? So is it your technical knowledge? Is it the application of that knowledge? Is it human factors? Where do you see yourself right now in your sort of coaching spectrum?
I still see it as something that I still see it as a human behavior factor. Of course, there's always things technically that we can work on, but I just haven't ran into a situation again yet where, let's look at our toolbox, right? Like we know that just in the weight room, from a weight room standpoint, we need to consistently work on movement quality. We need to work on getting the majority of athletes stronger, moving better, and then producing a higher rate of force development. And a lot of that stuff, right? Like it's kind of like that Mortal Kombat choose your destiny, right? Are we going to use just flat loading? Are we going to use ascending, descending sets? Are we going to use cluster modalities? Are we going to use wave, programming? And the answer is you can use all those things. But by and large, once you've worked with an athlete for, a number of months, years, what have you, eventually that runs out. But more importantly, what supersedes this? What gets an athlete to care about grinding out something in a range of 85 to 88% in order to derive the strength adaptation and neuromuscular qualities that we want, right? We've got to get them to care about it, because that's great that we may have some athletes that like to get under and strain the way that we like to strain, but the vast majority of them don't. So getting them to see the same sky or the same horizon is always the most critical, because it makes our intervention work. I would say that I continuously struggle with the buy-in piece, struggle being a good term, like we should all struggle with it because we're trying to deep dive into it. Because you look at the nature of today's athlete, and we're competing for attention span at a whole nother level than we were even in the year 2000. The New York Times said in the year 2000, the average attention span was 12 seconds. I think it's down to 6 the last time I checked the research on that. And you think about how kids learn now, the social media kind of factor at how, you're getting a lot of elite level athletes now that don't want to train when it comes to the offseason and team type environments. Now they want this one-on-one kind of concierge model, because it's better for their brand. It's better to post, videos of their training. It's better to do these kinds of things. And so you think about this and you're like, wow, like we really have people that are so self-driven and perception-driven that my coaching's got to evolve with it. You have MMA, right, which is, I think it's the fastest growing sport in the world right now. Their training age is essentially, if you could have a negative training age, like if somebody's training age could be -5, that would be the vast majority of MMA athletes. Of course, there's always going to be some out there that's not the case, but by and large, most mixed martial arts athletes have only been exposed to either base calisthenic circuits, some form of CrossFit, or what they consider to be high intensity training, even though that's the wrong use of that term, or just kind of this over-reliance on specificity, which is by and large why they have the injury rates that they do. So I think that we still and will always have to deal with buy-in, because you're going to have the team-setting guys that they may lay out great programming, Doug, but as you know, whether it's the team owner, whether it's the general manager, whether it's the medical staff, or even if it's the medical staff that's got their shit together and it's the performance staff, there's organizational issues. In the private sector, we have individual issues. It's always going to come down to problems of people over problems of performance first, and connecting those goes hand in hand. The last thing I'll say on that, if anybody's interested, is listen to the case study on guinea worm disease, the issue that they faced in Ghana, in which I think 3.5 million people in 1986 were afflicted by a parasite called the guinea worm. And it was spread by the drinking water, contaminated drinking water. The guinea worm would, release all of its eggs, larvae, what have you, into the drinking water. And it would do so because once people had it, got it in their system, when the guinea worm was ready to get out of their body, and it ejects itself out of their body, you'd get this burning sensation. So to relieve themselves of that burning sensation, people would run into the water. The guinea worm would spit out of the body. It would infect the water. More people would drink it, and it was self-perpetuating. Well, this is something that they thought was like a performance issue as well, from the standpoint that they said, no problem. We have a medical intervention that will work here, no different than we seek performance interventions, right? Like different loading modalities, different technology, different software, you name it. And they went in there and they tried with all these vaccines and medications. None of them worked. So what one guy went in and did is he said, no, you don't have a medical issue here. You have a human behavior issue. He goes, we got to get people to quit running into the damn water. So they started putting up signs and educating people and saying, like, listen, if you feel this, don't do that. And by and large, people quit doing it so much. Now listen to this sample size, right? And tell me how it compares to the 124 university-approved recreational trained subjects that we deal with in many of our studies. They had 3.5 million people affected in 1986. By 26 or 28 years later, just by following this kind of human behavior-based intervention, that was down to 156 cases, down from 3.5 million. 156 cases were only reported in Ghana. And they asked the person, they said, what was it? What was the magic bullet? And he goes, everything is a people issue. Everything is a behavior issue. It's just whether we see it and put it under the right frame.
Wow, that's really interesting. And I mean, I've had a similar experience where I'm certainly not satisfied with my technical ability, and I'm always trying to improve in that regard. But I mean, even with very high level people, it's rare that I get to utilize, even the majority of what I know. I probably implement a very small percentage of what I actually know on a daily basis. And I'm not even working in a team setting. I'm working one-on-one. I don't have all these inner team dynamics to worry about, political dynamics. It's just, one human being to one human being. And even in that environment, it's very difficult to influence behavioral change. So again, even harder on a broader, more macro level scale. Now, you're obviously, again, very, very self-aware, but there's limits to what you can achieve on your own. So what do you do to audit yourself and improve as a practitioner?
I try to study absolutely everything. I'm probably a little bit, it's like a gift and a curse. I think probably one of my biggest strengths is I'm pretty good at synthesizing things and seeing more commonalities, than differences, and being able to kind of weave those pieces together. Admittedly, my curiosity sometimes does get the best of me, and that means that whether it's reading 3 books at once, whether that's getting sidetracked, I'll be trying to get into the process of deep work on something, and I'm pretty easily sidetracked by a thought or some form of sub-vocalization, and then I'll start researching that. So to audit myself at the end of every year, and the beginning of every year, either or, it kind of depends where I'm at the time, I try to think about a couple things. Like, one, I try to just make my vision statement for myself a little bit more clear, like, where am I at? Where am I going? But instead of allowing myself kind of these base level answers, I try to say, why is that important to me? How am I acting upon that? Why does this matter? In what way am I showcasing this? I try to ask myself pretty deep probing questions, because I always kind of have this, I have this thing by my computer desk, and it just says, always grateful, never satisfied. And if anything, I try to discredit myself. People will laugh at this, and that's okay. But I very much have always resonated with like an artist like Eminem, from the standpoint that if you actually listen to his lyrics and you know anything about the person, as opposed to just the radio singles, like, he's always trying to outdo himself. And if anything, he's always his biggest critic, and he's always trying to prove himself almost like as a phony or a charlatan. He's always trying to expand that. Like, I'm very self-competitive, to the point where I think it drove my older brother nuts, and still does. My older brother and I, don't get along all the time, and it's because he's very competitive with me, and I don't really recognize that or entertain that. Like, I'm very much competitive with myself. So I try to find any weakness that I have and say, okay, I'm going to focus on these 3 things. With a book, to give you just a more practical example, so it doesn't seem like kind of like, fortune cookie thinking, I don't particularly like writing. It's funny, as a kid, I enjoyed English lit and all those kinds of things far more than I did math. But the only reason I probably wrote then is because, there was a mandatory time where we had to sit down and write, and I enjoyed that. In today's kind of world in my life as it is, I don't like it because I don't like being sedentary. I don't like sitting down. I probably have a fair amount of, if you want to call it ADD or what have you. Like, I'm at my best when I'm communicating face to face. I'm at my best when I'm kinetic. So my big challenge over the past 2.5, 3 years was to actually sit down and write a book. I mean, think about it. That's why you don't see, I don't write blogs. I'm not very active on those kinds of things. It's why social media works for me, because I can choose a picture and a thought and get it out really quickly and then go on with my day. But I've never really been big into actually sitting down and writing. So to force this conscious coaching kind of ideology was something that, has been with me for a while, but it became time that I really had to put pen to paper, clarify it, and put it out there. Otherwise, in my mind, I didn't know my shit, right? And it's kind of like, I don't know if you ever did this when you were younger, but if you'd go running, or you'd train or what have you, and you'd kind of say to yourself, if I didn't get this rep, this will happen, or if I don't make it these last 30 seconds, that will happen. Did you ever do anything like that, where you'd kind of create this kind of mental model that if you didn't accomplish this, then X, Y, or Z would happen? Or
yeah, I mean, I'm a little OCD too, so yes.
Yeah, so to me, I always just look at it of, okay, if I can't explain it clearly and concisely enough to go into a book, then I'm basically full of shit. And so that was a big thing of how I audited myself was, can I even get this book out? Because if I hadn't hired basically a devil's advocate to tell me to quit writing, this thing that is probably something I'd still be working on today because it was never good enough. It's the same way with how I deconstructed my programs. Here's another practical example. When I was at Southern Illinois, I worked for a guy that was really good at, making us always ask why. And this was kind of before the whole Simon Sinek, start with why craze. But he would mandate that we had to turn our programs into him, and he would just brutally deconstruct them. Why this? Why that? And he wasn't being rude. It was like oftentimes the answer was, yeah, I could have done X, Y, or Z, but I chose this because of that. And he just wanted to know that basically if we ever ended up, in a radical kind of, way of looking at it, if you ever ended up in kind of a strength coach court, if there ever was sort of thing, that you could defend it. Another reason why I've always defined, like, the hip hop thing has always resonated with me, right? You think of battle rap, like it's always this anticipation of what somebody else is going to say, and building your body off of work, not off only off a certain level of knowledge or expertise, but kind of the detraction that you can think of in your own head or others might think of. And I think that that's always been useful for me because it's kind of giving you this split personality sense of being able to be more critical of your own work, thinking, what would this person say, that person say, and not worrying about the judgments. That should never matter in what you do, but more recognizing, validating, and acknowledging the different frames and views that other people may have, because your athletes will have those too. So those self-audits are kind of just constantly testing myself against myself, trying to seek and define more clarity. It's something I'm struggling with right now when trying to create content, for presentations and workshops around the book, because there's so many different avenues you can go. Just that idea of clarifying and whittling away, I think, is the best way to always audit yourself. Simplify, simplify, simplify.
Yeah, and then what do you think, if there was this kind of like moment, was your greatest coaching moment where you encountered a really difficult situation and you were like, you had to fall back on everything you wrote about in the book, and you're like, wow, this actually worked out pretty well. I dodged a bullet there.
Yeah, you and I talked about it a little bit offline. I think it was when I was relatively young, and API put me in a position, thankfully, where, when I joined Athletes Performance before it was Exos, they didn't have many coaches down at the Florida facility, which is the one that I started at. And initially I was supposed to just, they had said, hey, we know you're getting out of graduate school and that you've been working with, 8 collegiate teams there and then also working with football and basketball, but we need somebody down here, admittedly, that can help us with Gen Pop, youth, high school, and then, return to play, high profile athletes that are basically coming over from the Andrews Institute and need to kind of get back on that wagon. So, I went over there expecting that, kind of got in a groove with that. And then very quickly that evolved into, hey, Brett, we also need you to work with our special forces operators, variants of wounded warriors. You need to go to military bases. We're going to send you to, whether it's Lackland Air Force Base, Pope Air Force Base, whether it's, and we need you to deliver these 2-week courses on basically everything from plyometrics to periodization to movement, and extrapolate on how that can benefit them right within the operational environment and the tactical environment. And then boom, it became, now we need you, we'd like you to run the NFL or pro sport kind of program. So all these situations, I think getting into them before I was truly ready was really important. And I think we undervalue that in our field. I think there's a correct idea of, hey, we need to volunteer, we need to intern, we need to do those things. But, all the knowledge and information in the world isn't going to help an intern or a young coach or volunteer be ready. They've got to jump into it. And that's the difference between experience and exposure, right? Like I can watch storm chasers on TV. That doesn't mean I know what it's like when there's a tornado warning in my town and what to do. I can watch traffic go by in New York City. It doesn't mean I know how to drive in it. And so, I think creating that culture is a huge piece, and just putting yourself out there before you're fully ready, because you've got to fail. Like we have this obsession with not failing in Western culture. Like you've got to taste your own blood to know what it's like to throw a better jab the next time and recognize that. So a part of me resonates with kind of that gladiatorial age a little bit. I think, Doug, like I really like studying history now, and I think about how human beings tested themselves back in gladiatorial times, or, even like, look at any time throughout history, whether it was the apprenticeship models and people learning from blacksmiths to young writers, to entrepreneurs, to people that went out and sailed and tried to explore. I think that's the standard we should be holding ourselves against, as opposed to this kind of, let's sit in front of a computer and just because we have access to information, think that it's going to be our savior.
Well, when you brought up the gladiator thing, if I was tech savvy, I would have pressed a button and had Maximus say, "Are you not entertained?
Are you not entertained?" Oh,
yeah.
That's funny. I put that in, literally, that went into one of my presentation slides that I just created. It's kind of like to say, hey guys, we have all the information you want now. Are you not entertained? At what point is this going to end and evolve? And are we as coaches going to be able to expand the conversation and get into the things that we really struggle with? So that's funny. No, that would have been perfect.
Well, we've only scratched the surface as far as the insight that you can provide into a lot of areas. So where can people learn more about you, whether it's your speaking engagements, your writing, your consulting, and that kind of thing?
I think first and foremost, hopefully, they find value in the book. The book is Conscious Coaching. You can literally just go to consciouscoachingbook.com. You can download free excerpts. You can learn a little bit more about it. I tried to put a video on there that tells you why I wrote the book. The book is for everybody. It's just written by a strength coach. So if you work with high performers of any kind, however you want to label that, teachers, doctors, what have you, that's what it's written for. Social media, I'm very easy to find. It's just at Coach_Brett B. I'm far more active on Twitter and Instagram than I am Facebook these days. So Twitter and Instagram, again, at Coach Brett B, or you can go to bartholomewstrength.com, and then there's avenues for you to get connected with me anywhere that you want. So those are probably the best places.
All right. Well, thanks again for your time, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future.
My pleasure. Thanks again, Doug. I really appreciate it and have tremendous respect for you. So thanks for having me on.
All right. Thank you.